One of the reasons to get better at delivering an argument is so you can do something good, you can do something right. But this concept of rightness and wrongness can be a little murky sometimes. Are you looking at the rightness of an action, or are you looking at the rightness of the outcomes? Well, today we're looking at ethics, and we're going to discuss different ethical perspectives to help you better understand how you're framing your argument and your own conceptions of right and wrong. So let's take a look. Ethics, the why behind your argument. What you can expect in this lecture is first we're going to just have a quick overview of ethics. After that, we'll discuss relativism. And then finally, we'll discuss two different ethical perspectives. So first, an overview of ethics. Ethics is known as the moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. So these are essentially the values that someone holds when they're determining right and wrong and determining how they're going to be conducting any sort of activity that they take place in. This is the branch of knowledge that deals with moral principles. Ethical relativists, on the other hand, these are individuals who believe that there are no universal standards of moral judgment, so the ethicist who would try and define such standards is working in vain. Now, when we think about most of us, if you were to say, hey, what's the difference between right and wrong, you could probably think that for pretty much everyone that you can think of some standards that really just go across cultures. So these ethical relativists that we're talking about here are pretty few and far between, because I think most people would say, it's wrong to be killing innocent people or killing, anything like that, where it just seems like this is something that most people would say that this is wrong regardless. But if you are taking the position that everything is relative in terms of ethics, then this is where you would end up. But that's really where it stops, because there are a lot of different types of relativism where we can look at this and still be able to make determinations on right or wrong based on kind of the way that we set up how we are figuring that out. So the types of relativism that we'll discuss are individual relativism, cultural relativism, and theoretical normative ethics. Individual relativism, this claims that the moral standards are relative to an individual's moral beliefs, that in effect what one believes is right with respect to one's own actions, and thus no sound moral judgment condemning the actions of a moral agent can be offered if the conclusion of the argument is inconsistent with the moral beliefs of the agent. So if you think about this, maybe there's something that you've gone through that really has shaped the way that you see certain events in terms of right and wrong. Maybe you know information or you've had experiences that other people haven't had, and that shapes the way that you see right or wrong in that particular context. So someone who would be an individual relativist, they're really saying, well, this is the way that I believe something is right or wrong, so you don't have the authority to condemn my actions because you really haven't lived my life. Getting to a broader perspective, we have cultural relativism. These are the moral standards that are relative to cultural moral beliefs. So ethical criticism here is only valid when communicated from one culture to the same culture. So essentially what we're saying here in the cultural relativism perspective is that our values are shaped by our culture. So if you are a member of a particular culture, then you understand what's considered to be right and wrong for that culture because of your experience. And therefore you're able to say to other people that they're doing something right or wrong within that culture because you have that shared ethical perspective. Okay, so notice that we're kind of broadening our perspective here. So originally we had individual relativism, where we're looking at our own experiences as a way to determine rightness or wrongness of an action. Here we're looking at the experience in a culture to be able to determine rightness or wrongness of an action. We get even more broad here with theoretical normative ethics. So here, this is the attempt to find general principles which specify the criteria that ought to be used in moral judgment and the grounds and reasoned arguments for these principles. In other words, we're looking for broad general principles that most people would agree with in order to make our ethical judgment. So here, the norm is generally the right thing to do. So how do most people act? How do most people see rightness or wrongness? Looking at the broadest perspective, the most general perspective that you can, and trying to make ethical determinations based upon these large sample sizes, trying to look at all of humanity as opposed to just individual cultures or individuals themselves. So moving on, we have two different ethical approaches. So before we were saying how we'd be able to judge the rightness or wrongness of an action, and if you have the moral authority to do so, based upon if you're an individual, you could only judge yourself. If you're a culture, you'd be able to judge within your own culture. And then the theoretical normative ethics saying that you're only able to judge by looking at the broadest perspectives. So pretty much you can look at anything. But here we're looking at, for a specific action, how you'd be able to evaluate it from there. So with ethical approaches, here's an easy way to remember this. So teleological, think telescope. So we're looking out into the future at outcomes. And deontological, think about don't do it right now. Okay, so hopefully these two little memory devices are going to help you out if you're trying to remember these two different ones. So teleological, think telescope, out into the future, looking at outcomes. Deontological, don't do that, like don't do that right now. So let's explore each of these and some individual approaches underneath these umbrellas. So first of all, the teleological approach is also known as consequentialism. Forgive the A there, it's not a consequentialism, it's also known as consequentialism. And here we determine the moral status of an action by the causal consequences or outcomes of an action. That is, an action is right or wrong according to whether it leads to good or bad consequences. So here we're looking at the outcomes of the action, not necessarily the action itself, but the outcomes of the action. And we're determining the moral status of that action by what happens with the outcome. So going back to this, so for example, if you were to cheat on a test, but then from there, even though you cheated on a test, you were able to pass that class, and then you're able to help a bunch of people because your major is involved in helping people, we would say in that case, well, we're looking at the outcome here, and you were able to help a lot of people by doing that cheating, so possibly this is something that's justifiable under this approach. Now, the deontological approach is also known as it's known as categorical. And here this denies what the teleological approach affirms. So it denies that the moral status of an action is determined by the consequences in favor of a view that human rights should be respected and moral obligations fulfilled, even if an optimal outcome is not achieved. So really what we're saying here is that, let's go back to that same example. Let's say you decide not to cheat on that test, but then you fail, and then you don't get to help all those people. Here we're saying this is still the right thing to do, even though you were not able to help all those people because it's wrong to cheat on a test. So the action itself is what we're evaluating, regardless of the consequences, because we're able to say that, if you're able to justify all these negative outcomes because it's better down the road, that a lot of times human rights can be violated here, and then also just moral obligations or just kind of doing the right thing is kind of pushed to the side. So here we're looking at the action itself as opposed to the consequences. So we'll look at some different theories under the teleological approach. So remember, teleological thinking outcomes, thinking telescope, you're looking out into the future with that telescope. So here we have one called ethical egoism. So the ethical egoist asserts that we are morally obligated to act in our own best interest, or stated as an ethical principle, one ought to do whatever is in one's own best interests. So here we're saying you're looking out for number one, and again, we're looking at the outcomes for yourself, right? So it's a teleological theory. So here, ethical egoism is looking at the outcomes, and it's kind of saying that, regardless of the action itself, you're trying to get the best outcomes for whatever is going on for yourself. We also have utilitarianism. So according to utilitarianism, the moral status of an action is determined by the actual or probable consequences that the action will have for everyone whose lives are affected by that action. So the biggest outcome for the biggest group of people. It's a little bit more complicated than this, but essentially here what we're looking at is how can you make it so everybody gets the best possible outcome? Now again, you're probably going to have some people who have a negative outcome, but here with utilitarianism, you're trying to say, well, we're going to have those people not have the ideal outcome because more people get a strongly positive outcome. Okay, so the best outcome for the largest group of people is really what we're trying to do here. On the other side, back to deontological theories. Remember, so teleological theories, thinking about that telescope, so looking out into the future. Deontological, like don't do that right now. So here we have kantianism. So this is given to us by Immanuel Kant. I believe this is from his book Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. And he says that the moral status of an action is not determined by the consequences. We are not morally obligated to seek the best overall outcome by our actions, but rather we are obligated to perform those actions that accord with our moral duty. So here what he is saying is that we are morally obligated to do the right thing in the moment, regardless of the outcome at all. Okay, so we are morally obligated to perform the actions that we think are right in the moment, regardless of the outcome at all. Okay. We also have contractarianism. So this is an ethical theory derived from the social contract political theory of Thomas Hobbes. And basically what he says here is that we should obey the laws of our government for the same reason that parties in a contract follow the terms of their contract. That it's a voluntary agreement that binds individuals to uphold, in both cases, certain obligations. So here what Hobbes is saying is that you should do the right thing in the moment because you've actually entered into a contract by living in a particular free society. So if you're able to move to another place and you decide to stay here, you are essentially saying that I'm going to follow the laws of this particular government, of this particular country, because of the way that they've set this up and because I'm voluntarily entering into that agreement. So, even if speeding to, get somewhere is going to be, breaking the law, you would be obligated not to break that law, even if, it was something really important that you needed to get to, because you've said that you're not going to be breaking those laws. Okay, so really what we covered today, first we just did a quick overview of ethics. We also discussed different types of relativism. Then last we discussed the two ethical perspectives of teleological and deontological theories. So this was a quick lecture on ethics, perspectives for your arguments, and hopefully now when you're thinking about ways that you're justifying rightness or wrongness of an action when you're crafting those arguments, you'll have a little bit more context to draw upon, and you'll be able to even further rationalize some of the decisions that you're making and the positions that you're upholding. Thanks.